A pregnant young woman vanished from Indianapolis around Thanksgiving 1984, leaving behind a small son and an anxious family. 6 weeks later, a turkey hunter discovered the bound and strangled body of a red-haired woman off Interstate 75 near Jellicoe, Tennessee. The victim had been wrapped in a blanket with duct tape and dumped over a guardrail, and she had no identification. For more than 3 decades, she would remain the Campbell County Jane Doe, one of several female victims with reddish hair found along southern highways in the early 1980s. This mystery persisted until advances in DNA technology and a renewed push by investigators finally unraveled the secrets behind the tragedy of Tina Farmer. Friends last saw Tina on Thanksgiving Day 1984, and family members reported her missing not long afterward. Her sister later contacted Indianapolis police again in 1992, emphasizing that the family still had no answers. It's unclear what actual steps were taken to investigate her disappearance at that time, although there were rumors that she might have left town voluntarily or gotten involved in illicit work. Nothing concrete surfaced. Tina was arrested in 1983, though none of the sources indicate what this arrest was for. She was fingerprinted as part of this process. However, given that there was speculation that she was involved in adult work, it's been speculated that this arrest may have been related to that. Notably, unbeknownst to her relatives, Tina was also about 2 months pregnant when she disappeared. On January 1st, 1985, a passerby noticed a body lying below a guardrail near Jellicoe on Interstate 75 in Campbell County, Tennessee. The victim was partially undressed, bound with strips of a t-shirt and gagged, and a blanket with duct tape was wrapped around her. The autopsy determined she had been strangled and had been dead for several days. Authorities couldn't match her to any missing person report, so they classified her as an unidentified victim and retained her fingerprints and a few items of evidence. The case soon became associated with several similar slayings in the region. Between 1978 and 1985, the bodies of at least 6 women with red or reddish hair were found along interstates in Tennessee, Kentucky, Arkansas, and West Virginia. Many were strangled and dumped with blankets or a variety of other makeshift coverings, and there began to be whispers of a serial predator on the loose. Media outlets dubbed these events the Redhead Slayings, and a multi-state task force formed in 1985 to share information and look for links. At the time, investigators speculated that a long-haul trucker could be targeting vulnerable women along highways. However, forensic science in the mid-1980s relied largely on blood typing and limited fingerprint databases, leaving authorities with few concrete leads. As months turned into years, the Campbell County Jane Doe case went cold. While the Jane Doe case languished, another disturbing incident offered a glimpse into the perpetrator's possible identity. However, the technology at the time just wasn't there yet, even if investigators suspected something more was at play. In March 1985, a Knoxville dancer known as Tasha met a truck driver named Jerry Leon Johns at a club. The appropriately named Johns offered to pay her for more action and drove her to a motel. And yeah, seriously, if this isn't nominative determinism at work, I don't know what is. When she tried to leave, he forced her into her car, tied her hands and feet with strips of her t-shirt, gagged her, and drove west on Interstate 40. He told her he was going to eliminate her and became angry when he discovered she dyed her hair rather than being a natural redhead. After parking in a wooded area, Johns wrapped a strip of cloth around her neck and strangled her until she lost consciousness. She was dumped into a drainage basin and was left there, with Johns presumably believing that he had just taken a life. Miraculously, she survived, crawled to the highway, and flagged down a helpful trucker who saved her life. Her description enabled police to quickly arrest Johns, who had also stolen Tasha's vehicle. Johns would be convicted in 1987, and the authorities speculated that based on his conduct, this wasn't his first rodeo, but they couldn't prove anything. In 2016, the Tennessee Bureau of Investigation resubmitted the blanket and clothing found with the Jane Doe for modern testing. This time, analysts detected a biological find that couldn't previously be seen and developed a genetic profile. If you've been following this story up until this point, you may have guessed that Jerry Johns was the man who would be the match. The breakthrough meant that Johns had been with the victim and was likely the one who had slain her. However, the victim was still a Jane Doe, and it wouldn't be for another 2 years that the identity of Tina McKinney Farmer and the Campbell County Jane Doe were linked up. An intrepid TBI detective ended up searching through the records and finding that Tina's case linked with the Campbell County Jane Doe in a lot of ways. Fortunately, Tina was arrested in 1983, so her fingerprints were on record, and the fingerprints of the Jane Doe had been taken intact. This was absolute confirmation that the Campbell Doe was Tina. Armed with the DNA match and the victim's identity, TBI investigators presented their findings to a Campbell County grand jury in late 2019. The panel concluded that Jerry Johns would have been indicted for a first-degree charge if he were still alive. For better or for worse, Johns had perished in prison in 2015 at age 67 and will never face justice for his actions. Hey everyone, it's Jimmy here reminding you to take a moment to subscribe and hit the notification bell, and also turn on all notifications. Also, don't forget to hit that hype button and hype this video up, since it allows the video to be more visible both to new viewers and to subscribers who haven't hit the bell. The discovery of thousands of human bone fragments strewn across an Indiana estate in the mid-1990s sounded like something out of a horror movie. Yet it was reality for the families of several missing men. Among those fragments were the remains of Daniel Halloran, a 22-year-old father from Colorado. Halloran vanished in 1993 without a missing person report and became one of the victims attributed to an Indiana property owner named Herb Baumeister. For decades, the bones collected from the property sat unidentified while families waited for answers. Only in 2025 did new forensic techniques allow Halloran's loved ones to finally learn what happened to him. Daniel Halloran was born on May 10, 1972, and grew up primarily in Colorado. As a young adult, he worked odd jobs and traveled back and forth between Colorado and Indiana. According to his daughter Coral, he had a tumultuous relationship with her mother, and by 1993, the couple's relationship had deteriorated. That year, when Coral was almost 2 years old, Halloran returned to Indiana and he never came back, and within a short time his communication stopped entirely. Because he lived somewhat itinerantly and had few bills or records, his disappearance wasn't reported to authorities at the time. Coral's mother hired private investigators and even reached out to social services, but there were no matches in missing person databases. For Coral, the lack of information led to conflicting emotions, and she wondered if her father had abandoned her family or if something more sinister had happened. Her aunt eventually suggested contacting the coroner's office, since it became clear that Danny had simply dropped off the face of the earth, but that too led to nothing at the time. When Halloran vanished, local news in Indiana had begun to focus on a series of disappearances among gay men in their 20s and early 30s. Investigators suspected that a predator was targeting men at bars in Indianapolis, strangling them and dumping their bodies. Suspicion eventually fell on an outwardly successful businessman named Herb Baumeister. Baumeister owned a chain of thrift stores and lived on an 18-acre estate called Fox Hollow Farm in Westfield, Indiana. In August 1995, police received a call from a man who claimed that someone named Brian Smart had taken him to a house with an indoor pool and attempted to strangle him with a hose. The man escaped, but another victim later identified his attacker as Baumeister. Detectives went to his wife and asked for permission to search Fox Hollow Farm, a request which she granted. Her son had previously found what appeared to be human remains on the property, but Baumeister played it off like it was no big deal. Clearly, Herb's wife harbored significant suspicions, though, so when the police came knocking, she wanted answers too. What investigators found shocked them. Scattered across the wooded property were more than 10,000 bones and bone fragments. The remains belonged to at least 11 people, though many bones were charred and crushed, making identification difficult. Some victims were only partial skeletons, and bone fragments showed evidence of burning. Because many of the missing men frequented gay bars, investigators theorized that Baumeister targeted gay or bisexual men, luring them to his estate under the pretense of good times. With the evidence mounting, authorities issued a warrant for Baumeister's arrest. Instead of surrendering, he fled to Canada and went deep into a provincial park in Ontario, where he finally ended his disturbing spree. In his note, he talked about failing businesses and marriage troubles, but didn't confess to anything. Daniel Halloran wasn't openly gay and didn't fit the stereotypes investigators initially associated with Baumeister's victims. He may have frequented bars or social circles that overlapped with Baumeister's hunting grounds. Halloran was described by friends as adventurous and sometimes impulsive, and after moving back to Indiana in 1993, he was seen around Indianapolis's nightlife scene. Investigators believe that sometime after March 1994, he encountered Baumeister and accepted an invitation to Fox Hollow Farm. Some believe he may have been lured there with the promise of illicit substances, rather than for other forms of action. Once there, Baumeister eliminated him, though the reasons for this remain a mystery, much like all of his crimes. For decades, Halloran's remains would be cataloged but ultimately unidentified. One obstacle to identifying Halloran's remains was that both of his parents and his brother were deceased. However, investigators discovered that his mother's DNA had been collected after she perished from an overdose. The authorities extracted a DNA profile from bone fragments recovered at Fox Hollow Farm and compared it with the sample from Halloran's mother. Coral Halloran, Daniel's daughter, would end up providing her own sample to confirm the match with absolute certainty. For Coral Halloran, learning the fate of her father brought mixed emotions. Growing up, she wrestled with uncertainty, at times thinking her father might have chosen to disappear. Coral went on record saying that she felt a combination of grief and relief upon finding out the fate of her father. However, she was of course sickened to learn how Baumeister eliminated him on Fox Hollow Farm. As of 2025, 3 DNA profiles from Fox Hollow Farm remain unmatched. Hamilton County authorities continue to work with private companies, state labs, and the University of Indianapolis to identify those individuals. Ultimately, but for advances in forensic technology, Daniel Halloran's disappearance would have likely remained an unsolved mystery for all time. Halloran vanished in 1993, and like many of Herb Baumeister's suspected victims, left behind no missing person report or paper trail. The mystery began on an ordinary June day in 2014 when highway workers along a rural road near Geneva, Wisconsin, spotted 2 weathered suitcases abandoned near a guardrail. When they inspected one of them to see if it contained trash, they discovered something far more chilling: decomposing human remains. They immediately alerted the authorities and didn't dare investigate any further. The second suitcase, dragged from the ditch by deputies, held another body. The gruesome scene immediately drew national attention, and investigators began piecing together how the victims ended up folded inside luggage and left beside a highway. The search for answers would span states, draw in forensic specialists, and reveal a crime committed by a man who once wore a police badge. Jenny Games was born in the early 1990s and grew up mostly in the Oregon foster care system. Accounts from her foster family describe her as an optimistic young woman trying to build a stable life despite a turbulent childhood. In August 2012, she left the home of her foster father in Cottage Grove, Oregon, telling relatives she was going to visit friends. She was 19 at the time and starting to navigate adulthood, so her foster family didn't immediately report her missing. She had been somewhat estranged from them for a while, so her disappearance didn't initially trigger alarm, and there was no missing person case for investigators to consult. It would take almost 2 years for authorities to determine what happened after she left Oregon, in part because her remains were severely decomposed when discovered. During this time, her uncanny forensic reconstruction would go viral across the internet and traditional media outlets, leading to substantially more attention than usual on her case. Jenny's path tragically crossed with that of Stephen Zellick, a former Wisconsin police officer. Zellick had resigned from the police force years earlier after allegations that he harassed and stalked women while on duty. He continued to frequent websites under aliases such as MrHandcuffs, trolling for women interested in extremely rough activity. Investigators later learned that Jenny interacted with Zellick on one of these sites and agreed to meet him in person. In late 2012, Jenny flew from Oregon to Wisconsin, and Zellick met her at the Milwaukee airport and drove her to a hotel in Kenosha County. According to the criminal complaint, the two spent several days together engaging in what I will euphemistically call a choking game. On the last day, Zellick later claimed he lost control, and instead of seeking help, he placed her body in a suitcase. For months, he stored the suitcase, first in his refrigerator and later in the trunk of his car, while he continued to work as a security guard. Zellick's pattern of meeting women on websites would repeat, and in November 2013, he lured 37-year-old Laura Simonson, a mother of 7 from Minnesota, to a hotel in Rochester. He claims that he again lost control during a quote-unquote choking game and then accidentally slew her as well. In June 2014, he drove to rural Walworth County and dumped both suitcases off the side of the road, believing nobody would find them. Notably, the forensic reconstruction of Jenny, which ended up going viral for its supposed poor quality, ended up being the thing that would give her back her name. Since Jenny's reconstruction was seen by so many people who knew her and knew she was missing, saw her exaggerated facial features, and knew it was her. From there, dental records provided the final key to unlocking Jenny's identity, and investigators received dental information from her dentist. They compared it to the remains, and the match confirmed the victim was the missing 19-year-old from Oregon. With the victims identified, investigators traced their last communications. Laura Simonson's missing person case had pointed to a man she planned to meet at a motel. Some of her friends were aware that the man she was going to meet went by the online handle MrHandcuffs, which gave investigators an evidentiary thread to tug on. Detectives subpoenaed records from quote-unquote dating websites and found that the same username had contacted Jenny and Laura. The information provided eventually led to Stephen Zellick's West Allis apartment. Police obtained a search warrant and immediately arrested him on 2 counts of hiding a corpse. During his interrogation, he claimed the deaths of the women were accidental, but the physical evidence contradicted these claims. Zellick had already purchased materials to hide the bodies, including suitcases and padlocks, and had taken steps to keep the bodies hidden for months. Prosecutors argued that his behavior suggested premeditation rather than panic. The legal proceedings lasted several years and spanned 2 states. In Wisconsin, Zellick initially faced a first-degree intentional slaying charge, which carries a mandatory life sentence. He eventually reached a plea agreement with prosecutors. In January 2016, he pleaded guilty to a reduced count of first-degree reckless slaying and an additional charge of hiding a corpse. During the plea hearing, he again claimed he and Jenny consensually engaged in everything, and it was all just a big accident that happened twice. The judge sentenced Zellick to 35 years in prison for Jenny's slaying and 5 years for concealing her corpse, and from there, he was shipped off to Minnesota to face further justice. In Minnesota, Zellick pleaded guilty in 2017 to a second-degree count in Laura Simonson's case. A judge there imposed a 25-year sentence, and for some reason, the Minnesota sentence will run concurrently with the Wisconsin term. Notably, Zellick has attempted to appeal his convictions, arguing that he had ineffective counsel, though as of yet, this hasn't gone anywhere, and this former cop remains locked up. As of now, I would hope that the authorities are going back through his records from his time as a cop and seeing if he was involved in any unusual incidents during his tenure.